On the night of April 4th, an 8-foot inflatable dinghy drifted through pitch-black water off the coast of the Bahamas. Inside it was one man, soaked, exhausted, and alone. His name was Brian Hooker, and according to him, his wife had just vanished into the sea. Her name was Lynette Hooker, 55 years old, a wife, a mother, and, to hundreds of thousands of strangers online, half of one of the internet's favorite retirement fairy tales. For years, Brian and Lynette posted under the name The Sailing Hookers, sunsets, paddleboards, a boat called Soulmate. The story they told the world was simple. Two people who'd spent decades together on land, then walked away from all of it to chase freedom on the water. Lynette had reportedly quit a career she loved and sold her house to fund the dream. To their followers, it looked like the ultimate second act. Lynette was almost always the one holding the camera, narrating, smiling. Brian was rarely on screen. And that gap, between the woman who built the brand and the man standing just outside its frame, would end up mattering more than anyone watching those videos could have guessed. Because behind the curated feed, there were cracks, and they showed up almost immediately. In January of 2024, barely 6 weeks into their new life aboard Soulmate, the marriage nearly ended. Lynette left the boat and flew to Florida to stay with her mother. She opened up to a friend and fellow boater named Marnie Stevenson, who, along with her husband Blaine, had met the Hookers the year before while cruising through Florida. "I guess it was too much closeness," Lynette wrote to Stevenson. "We decided to call it quits. I'm not going back." Describing the collapse of a marriage that had lasted more than 2 decades on land, she put it bluntly. Their life together had survived barely 6 weeks of full-time cruising. "It was real bad," she wrote. "I can't be out there with him." A month later, something shifted. Stevenson checked in, asking if things were improving. Lynette answered with heart emojis and a thumbs up. By late February 2024, the couple had reconciled, and the sailing dream resumed, publicly at least, without a hitch. Neither woman could have known that 2 years later, those private messages would surface as evidence in a federal criminal investigation into Lynette's disappearance. So what actually happened on the water that night in April? To answer that, we have to start exactly where investigators did, with the story Brian Hooker told police. To understand where this case stands today, you have to start with Brian Hooker's version of events, because almost everything that's happened since has been investigators testing it piece by piece against what he originally told them. The setting, Hope Town, in the Abaco Islands of the Bahamas, a postcard village of pastel cottages and a candy-striped lighthouse, popular with cruisers exactly like the Hookers. Around 7:30 in the evening, just minutes after sunset, Brian and Lynette left the Abaco Inn to head back to Soulmate, their sailboat, anchored roughly a mile away in Aunt Pat's Bay near Elbow Cay. Rather than take the sailboat itself, they climbed into their small 8-foot inflatable dinghy for the short ride back. According to Brian, the seas turned rough almost as soon as they set out. The dinghy lost stability, and Lynette went overboard. Here's the detail that shapes the entire case. Brian says Lynette was wearing the engine's safety kill switch lanyard, a cord attached to the driver that automatically cuts the motor if the wearer is thrown from the boat. When she fell, he says, the engine died instantly, leaving him adrift without power in the dark, with no way to circle back or call for help by radio. In a recorded phone call, his friend Blaine Stevenson later shared publicly. Stevenson has said he began recording specifically to help keep track of details for the search, a man identified as Brian described. The collapse of events as a cascade of failures. He said neither he nor Lynette were wearing life jackets that night. Brian's account is that he briefly saw Lynette swimming toward shore before the current pulled them apart. In a text message to a friend 2 days later, he wrote that she had been swimming toward the sailboat when he lost sight of her. From there, he says, the tiny dinghy drifted through the Sea of Abaco for hours, no engine, no lights, no way to signal. While he bailed water with his hands and paddled with a single oar, fighting to keep the boat upright in 20-mile-an-hour winds. At around 3:35 in the morning on April 5th, roughly 4 miles from where he says Lynette went overboard, Brian finally washed ashore near the Marsh Harbor boatyard. He pushed through brush in the dark until he found the boatyard itself, where he alerted someone who called police. Richard Cook, fire team lead with the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue, later confirmed elements of this account to reporters, saying Brian reported last seeing his wife swimming toward shore before they were separated. Soon after, Brian posted to Facebook, writing that he was heartbroken over the recent boat accident in unpredictable seas and high winds that caused Lynette to fall from their dinghy. Despite desperate attempts to reach her, he wrote, the winds and currents drove us further apart. We continue to search for her, and that is my sole focus. Bahamian authorities, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, Hopetown Fire and Rescue, and eventually the U.S. Coast Guard launched a search by sea and by air. For those first few days, this looked exactly like what it was being reported as, a tragic accident on the water and a rescue operation racing against time to bring a missing woman home. That would not last. Within days, the search downgraded from rescue to recovery, the grim procedural shift that signals officials no longer expect to find someone alive. And then it escalated again, into something far more serious. The U.S. Coast Guard opened an active criminal investigation into Lynette's disappearance, a step authorities don't take lightly, and one that immediately changed the tenor of everything that followed. On April 8th, 4 days after Lynette vanished, the Royal Bahamas Police Force took Brian into custody. Assistant Commissioner Edvardo Dames told reporters he was being held for additional questioning based on some probable cause we have. 2 days later, on April 10th, Brian was questioned for more than 3 hours at Central Police Station in Grand Bahama, specifically about his relationship with Lynette and whether he had caused her harm, according to his attorney, Terrell Butler. Butler later told NBC News that during that questioning, Brian was specifically asked about a potential charge of causing harm resulting in death. A line of inquiry, Butler said, suggested investigators believed he may have played some role in his wife's death. Then came a strange, almost unbelievable twist in an already strange case. Butler told reporters that police took a handcuffed Brian back out on Soulmate to help retrace the route and search for Lynette. Conditions that day were heavy rain and strong winds. While disembarking, Brian, his hands cuffed in front of him, gripping a change of clothes, lost his footing on the wet, unstable deck and fell overboard into the choppy water. He was wearing a life vest and was pulled out by officers within moments, but came away with a swollen knee and visible abrasions that later required medical treatment and left him limping. Under Bahamian law, police had until a set deadline, 7:20 p.m. that Friday, to either formally charge Brian or release him. They asked for and were granted an extension. Finally, on April 13th, after 5 full days in custody, he was released without charges. Butler said flatly that police had no evidence to hold her client. Royal Bahamas Police Commissioner Shanta Knowles confirmed to NBC News that the decision came after consulting with prosecutors, but stressed that Brian remained a suspect and that the investigation was ongoing. It's important to be precise here, because this detail matters for everything that follows. Brian Hooker has never been charged with a crime in connection with Lynette's disappearance. At every stage, he has categorically and unequivocally denied any wrongdoing through his attorneys. But questions were already mounting from someone close to the family. Lynette's daughter, Carly Aylesworth, began speaking publicly almost immediately, first asking for help finding her mother and sharing a GoFundMe to support search efforts, and later raising increasingly pointed questions about her stepfather's account. "I'm still in a lot of shock right now that this is even a conversation," she said in the early days. She's since said publicly that his story just doesn't add up, and told reporters she believes something might have happened to her mom. She's also described her stepfather's demeanor in the aftermath as unsettling. She says he called her the evening after Lynette disappeared, roughly 24 hours later, to tell her what happened, and that she hasn't spoken to him since. 3 days after the disappearance, Aylesworth received a voicemail from Brian, which she later shared with News Nation. In it, He calmly updates her that Hopetown Search and Rescue had located a flotation device he says he'd thrown to Lynette when she went overboard, narrowing, he explained, the area they were now focusing the search on. He closes the message telling her he loves her. Aylesworth has described his tone in that recording as flat and eerily composed, not the panic she says she would have expected from a husband whose wife had just vanished. Family friends who spoke with reporters echoed a similar unease. Brian's own friend, Blaine Stevenson, told Fox News that Brian stayed aboard Soulmate for about a day after Lynette vanished and said, "At no point did he really look at the situation and give anybody any more details than he had at the beginning, when supposedly he was in shock." By the time Brian walked out of the Grand Bahama police station, this had stopped being simply a missing person case. It had become something else entirely, a criminal investigation with a person of interest, a lawyer speaking in carefully calibrated legal language, and a family beginning to publicly doubt the official story. As scrutiny intensified, so did the picture of the Hooker's marriage, and it was far more complicated than the sunset photos ever suggested. Carly Aylesworth has alleged, in interviews with CNN, Fox News and News Nation, that her mother confided in her about a history of abuse, including, she says, an incident where Brian choked her mother. "There's a history of him choking her out and threatening to throw her overboard," Aylesworth told Fox News. It's important to note that CNN has stated it was unable to independently confirm that specific choking incident with law enforcement. This remains an allegation from a family member, not a verified finding, and Brian's attorney has denied the allegations on his behalf. Aylesworth has also offered a more personal and in some ways more unsettling portrait, describing what she says was a shift in her stepfather's personality when he drank. According to her, alcohol brought out a different side of him, needling, provocative, deliberately pushing buttons he knew would upset the people around him. More specific, and more chilling given the circumstances, is what Aylesworth says her mother told her in January of this year, just months before the trip that ended in Lynette's disappearance. She says Lynette confided that Brian had threatened during an argument on the boat to throw her overboard. "He's threatened it, I'm pretty sure, multiple times," Aylesworth said in one interview. "He's done actions to her that have hurt her." The fact that this is happening now is kind of coincidental. In a separate interview, she put it more starkly. "It's just funny because he said he was going to do this, and now it's happening." The documented record adds more texture and, notably, complicates any simple narrative. In February of 2015, police were called to the Hooker's home in Kentwood, Michigan. According to the police report, Lynette, who officers described as highly intoxicated, told them Brian had struck her in the forehead after she tried to get into a locked upstairs room where her children were, and that he had choked her and punched her once. Brian, for his part, told police that Lynette had struck him in the face several times after he went upstairs to try to calm her down. Officers documented that Brian had a swollen, bloody nose and that he declined medical treatment. Lynette was the one taken into custody that night on a charge of assault and battery, but the warrant against her was ultimately denied. The report cited insufficient evidence as to who had actually started the altercation. No charges were filed against either party, and the case was closed the following day. Then there's a case from a decade earlier, in 2005, that's drawn renewed attention since Lynette's disappearance. Brian was accused of choking one of his children during a visitation dispute at the family home. Witnesses told police the argument started after Brian became upset about a science textbook the child was using for homeschooling, reportedly related to how the book addressed the origins of life. According to a supplemental police report, one child witness said Brian chased the child upstairs, pinned the child against a door, and placed both hands around the child's neck, with one witness saying the child was lifted partially off the ground. Brian was arraigned on a fourth-degree child abuse charge in November of 2005, and per court records was ordered to have no contact with his minor children while the case proceeded. At trial, Lynette testified in Brian's defense, telling the court she didn't believe he had choked the child. The case ended in an acquittal in 2006. There's also a chapter that predates Lynette entirely, According to documents reported by the Daily Mail and referenced in subsequent coverage, Brian's first wife, Elizabeth Hoseth, sought a personal protection order against him in 1999, several months after filing for divorce. In her filing, Hoseth alleged Brian had threatened her with what she described as an accident during their final interaction that October, and described a marriage marked by drinking and what she called verbal, emotional, and physical abuse, including being kicked, pushed down, and spat on. A criminal defense attorney interviewed by News Nation, Mark Lichtman, noted that a documented pattern of alleged violence toward a previous spouse can, in some circumstances, be introduced as evidence in a case involving harm to a subsequent spouse, though he was speaking generally about how such history can function in court, not offering an opinion on this case specifically. One additional detail has circulated in tabloid coverage, but has not been independently corroborated by major outlets. Aylesworth has reportedly told the Daily Mail that security footage from Soulmate showed a brief flash of light near the anchored boat, roughly 17 minutes after Brian says Lynette went overboard. Because this detail comes from a single source and hasn't been confirmed elsewhere, we're flagging it here rather than presenting it as established fact. But it's part of what's circulating around this case as scrutiny has grown. None of this proves what happened to Lynette on April 4th. A decades-old acquittal and a mutual 2015 dispute that resulted in no charges for either party are not, on their own, evidence of a crime committed in 2026. But taken together with Aylesworth's more recent allegations, they've become part of the backdrop investigators and the public are weighing as this case has developed. For weeks after Lynette disappeared, search efforts were concentrated in the area Brian described, the stretch of water between Hopetown and Elbow Cay. Then, in mid-May, the investigation began seizing physical evidence, and by late May, everything about the search itself shifted. On May 8th, the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service intercepted Soulmate roughly 40 nautical miles off the coast of Melbourne, Florida, as it was being sailed back to the United States by boat movers. It was towed to the Fort Pierce Coast Guard Station, and drone footage obtained by CBS News showed it docked there, undergoing forensic evaluation. Carly Aylesworth learned of the seizure only secondhand. In a Mother's Day video message to followers, she said she was aware Soulmate had left the Bahamas but had received no direct update from investigators. "It's the first Mother's Day without my mom," she said. "It's pretty hard right now to know that she's not a text away anymore." Weeks later, in early June, the 8-foot dinghy itself was also seized by Coast Guard investigators, a moment captured on camera as the small boat was ferried by tender to a Coast Guard cutter. An investigator was seen aboard, examining the dinghy and holding up a life jacket, while a cadaver dog stood by. Then came a detail that hadn't previously been public. Soulmate was equipped with a high-end FLIR, forward-looking infrared, thermal imaging system, worth roughly $33,000, mounted on the boat's mast. The system was designed to detect heat signatures in complete darkness, and according to a friend of the couple, could even be set to automatically track a person's movement by body heat alone. That friend, Daniel Danforth, who met the Hookers in 2023 in New Orleans, told Fox News Digital and News Nation that he alerted the Coast Guard to the camera's existence in early May, before Soulmate was even seized. He says investigators told him it was the first they'd heard that such a system was on board, and that they planned to seek a warrant to seize it specifically, since the unit had its own serial number and might retain recoverable data. Danforth recalled that Brian had once demonstrated the system's capabilities to him personally, setting it to detect body heat and tracking a person walking along a dock in real time. Given that capability, Danforth said, everything points to it not being an accident at all. There's never been a consistent story. To be precise about what's actually confirmed, though, CBS News has reported that it remains officially unknown whether Brian used the camera that night. Investigators have not stated that he didn't, only that its existence wasn't disclosed to them until Danforth's tip. The system has since been seized and is being processed for data as part of the ongoing investigation, and whether it holds anything relevant to that night is still unresolved. There was another piece of digital evidence that surfaced during this stretch, and maritime experts say it's one of the stranger details in the entire case. Every vessel like Soulmate carries an AIS transponder, a system that continuously broadcasts the boat's identity, speed, and position to other ships and to maritime authorities. According to tracking data obtained by Fox News Digital from the marine tracking company Vessel Finder, Soulmate's AIS signal went dark at 9:29 that night, April 4th, and did not come back online until 8:40 the following morning. A blackout of more than 11 hours, spanning almost exactly the window investigators care most about. Kenneth Engerand, an adjunct professor of maritime law at the University of Houston, told Fox News Digital that a gap like that is highly unusual. Systems like this typically fail for one of a few reasons, he explained. Catastrophic power loss, physical destruction of the unit, or someone manually switching it off. A transponder that goes dark and then comes back online on its own schedule doesn't fit the profile of simple equipment failure. Reporting has also indicated there were at least 3 additional AIS blackout periods aboard Soulmate in the days that followed. Though what caused those gaps and whether they're connected to the investigation has not been publicly explained. The most significant break, though, came from something much smaller than a boat or a transponder, a personal electronic device. A U.S. official told CBS News, CNN, and NBC News that investigators had recovered GPS location data from one of Brian's devices, and that the track it showed did not match the account he'd given police. Rather than drifting passively in the area he described near Elbow Cay, the data reportedly showed the device moving with purpose through a different section of the Sea of Abaco, stopping for a period of time, then returning toward shore. The implication, according to officials, was significant and damning if true. For weeks, search and rescue teams may have been combing the wrong stretch of ocean entirely, based on the location Brian himself had provided. Because the search area falls within Bahamian territorial waters, even though Soulmate is U.S. flagged, the Coast Guard had to formally request permission from Bahamian authorities before sending a dive team to the newly identified coordinates. That permission came through, and on June 2nd, a Coast Guard cutter and dive team arrived in the Bahamas, supported by the Royal Bahamas Police Force, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and a cadaver dog named Maggie from the Broward County Sheriff's Office. For several days, divers searched the Sea of Abaco at the new coordinates, while search teams on land combed the shoreline near Hopetown. Carly Aylesworth said she was grateful for the renewed effort, telling ABC News, "She has to be somewhere, so all the help that we could get, it's greatly appreciated." Though she added with evident resignation, "I hope she's just in Cuba or something, just needing a break from life. But I don't really have much faith that she's out there still alive." That search concluded days later. Lynette Hooker's body was not found. More than 3 months after Lynette Hooker went missing, this case sits in a strange kind of limbo, one shaped as much by law and geography as by evidence. Without a body, there's no autopsy, no toxicology report, no physical confirmation of how, or even that, Lynette died. Cases like this are notoriously difficult to prosecute. Prosecutors need to establish not just a suspect, but a cause and manner of death, and right now, none of that exists on paper. The FBI's evidence processing facility in Quantico, Virginia, has reportedly been handling forensic material from the case, according to a U.S. official who spoke with CBS News, but no findings from that processing have been made public. There's also a genuine jurisdictional tangle. Lynette disappeared in Bahamian waters, which means any potential prosecution has to navigate cooperation between the Royal Bahamas Police Force and U.S. federal agencies, including decisions about which country's laws would even apply, and how physical and digital evidence gets shared across that border. When American citizens are killed abroad, U.S. federal law does provide potential avenues for prosecution back in the United States. But whether, or how, that framework might eventually apply to this specific case has not been publicly confirmed by officials, and as of now, no charges have been filed by either country. In his first interviews after being released, Brian told NBC News he was choosing to believe Lynette was still alive, saying he'd been told people have survived in the waters around the Bahamas for days, even weeks, given how many islands there are to potentially wash up on. He described the 10 days since her disappearance as the longest stretch he'd ever spent apart from her in a marriage. Various outlets have reported at both 21 and 25 years, depending on how the length is counted. "I'm not really capable of just turning away from this," he told reporters at the time. As for Brian, after his release in April, he returned to the United States, to his home in Onstead, Michigan, citing his mother's declining health as the reason he needed to leave the Bahamas, despite telling ABC News just hours earlier that his sole focus was staying to find his wife. He hired a Grand Rapids-based attorney, Crystal Marie Hauser, who has publicly asked people to extend him the same benefit of the doubt they'd want for themselves, saying, "We all handle things in different ways." Brian himself has maintained near total public silence since, communicating only through his lawyers. In a written statement after his release, he said he remained committed to finding his wife and was dedicating his time to coordinating search efforts. He has never been charged. He continues to deny any wrongdoing. Carly Aylesworth, for her part, has walked a careful line publicly. Shortly after Brian's release, she told CNN, "As long as there has been a thorough investigation into all the facts, then I'll have to live with the fact that it's an accident. But I don't think this is the end." She's continued pushing for answers, calling for a full investigation with U.S. government involvement, and has said she wants to understand, above all, why her stepfather paddled away from the spot where her mother went overboard, instead of staying to search for her at the scene. For now, Soulmate and the dinghy remain in federal custody, waiting on forensic results that could either confirm Brian Hooker's account or dismantle it completely. The FLIR camera's data is still being processed, and in the waters off Elbow Cay, the search for Lynette Hooker has gone quiet, but it hasn't been declared over. Somewhere between a tragic accident at sea and something far darker, the truth is still sitting at the bottom of the Sea of Abaco. And until it surfaces, one way or another, this remains exactly what investigators have treated it as from the start, an open, active case, not a closed one, and not, despite months of suspicion, a proven crime. If there are new developments in this case, we'll be tracking them, and we'll be back the moment there's something real to report.